And then the recordings will be available on online. There'll be a link to them on the web page. So you will have the recordings. There are also some resources listed on the web page. There's a link to, no, I'm sorry, I've got all the commentaries that are here for my Sunday sermon series, but not the commentaries. There's a link for Father Fred's book on Revelation, and then the Interpretations Bible series or Bible commentary series on Daniel. And then you may have noticed that we had a little video on Daniel. The Bible Project has done some, it's not there. Bible Project has done some wonderful videos that we'll be using throughout this course because they're just really helpful on various topics and stories, and on different types or different things that are important about this type of literature. So they'll also be linked if you want to watch them again. And we'll try and make sure that the PowerPoints that are shown during the session or shared are also available in a link, so that we're going to try and manage the transfer of all this information better than we have in other classes. We'll see how that goes, because it's a lot of material to link to, but we do want you to be able to have it, especially if you've got to miss a class or if you need to leave early. Those things will be up probably by the weekend after the class, but maybe not first thing Thursday morning. Let me see what else. I think that's all about all the sort of classroom details. There are no quizzes, there are no tests, you don't have to write any essays. So like I said, we're shooting for what's on the calendar. I'm not going to guarantee we're going to get there every week, but we'll see what we can do. And a lot of this, we're not going to be able to do a verse-by-verse study. That'll be even more obvious when we get to Revelation, but Daniel too, because a verse-by-verse study would be all of this year, and then perhaps part of next. And I don't think you really want to do Daniel and Revelation for quite that long. I'm going to let Father Fred start this evening so that we can get a little bit of a background in apocalyptic literature. All of us have kind of different ideas about what apocalyptic literature is really about. I will give you a clue now. It is not about the end of the world. So we'll find out what it really is about. And it's an important form. It's a prevalent form in both the the Old Testament as well as the New Testament. And we need to be able to both identify it and understand what its purpose is and what its purpose was understood to be in the first century or before Daniel was written, before that, so that we understand why people and why Jewish tradition had picked it up. The other thing, Father Fred's dissertation work was on Jewish apocalyptic literature, the ethics and eschatology of it, and the work of Jesus. That is a very short summary. The title of his dissertation he read to me earlier takes fully 30 seconds. So I didn't think he needed for me to read the whole thing. But since he's the expert, and what I learned in seminary about apocalyptic literature, I learned in seminary from people like him. I'm going to let him go ahead and do the class for this evening so that you all can get benefit of what he's got to do. And like I said, do feel free to interrupt, because that's important to get your questions out on the table as we go. We're Anglicans, so we're not going to end up being real fundamentalist about all of this. I hope that makes all of you feel really good. Ashley's laughing hysterically, but there are ways to use this literature. And I think for Anglicans, we end up getting really scared because those people have done so many terrible things with it. want to sort of abandon the attitude about those people, and I also want to sort of help us get past the sort of fright feeling of dealing with all of this literature. So it's all yours.
Okay, great. It's good to see everybody. You can hear me okay? Okay. Let me share the screen with you. And do I need to use a kind of full screen presentation, or
Start
can you see this? Okay. And what I'll do, this will make it hard for me to see you. So feel free to speak up if you have questions. I will also pause from time to time and get out of the slideshow so that we can talk about sections of this.
I can see them all.
Well, that's true, and I can see it. Okay. So tonight what we're going to do is we're going to talk about apocalyptic literature, and as a category. And what I want to do is focus on a handful of ways in which people typically read it. The word apocalypse and the phrase apocalyptic literature refers to a particular genre or kind of literature in the Bible. There are extra biblical apocalypses as well, but we're not going to focus on those in the weeks that we have together. And elements of apocalyptic literature can be found in the book of Ezekiel, the second half of Daniel, which we're going to spend time with, the 13th chapter of Mark, and of course the big example of it in the New Testament is the book of Revelation. And those are the larger sort of features of apocalyptic literature in Scripture. Historically, and there have been examples of these approaches that go all the way back to the early centuries of the church, there have been three different ways of approaching apocalyptic literature. One has been to read it as a roadmap to the future, and in particular as a roadmap of the immediate future of anyone reading apocalyptic literature. I'll say more about each of the three in a moment. The second approach is to read apocalyptic literature as a timeless myth. And I don't want you to misunderstand what I mean by the word myth here. The word myth in popular parlance often means something that's false, something that's not true. But the fact of the matter is that another deeper and more profound use of myth is the use of myth as a story or a series of images, the truth of which lies in what they reveal about something else, not in the details of the story itself. So, oh, I'm so sorry.
He got Siri all excited.
All of a sudden, Siri wants to answer questions.
My apologies.
She's really sorry she doesn't understand his questions.
I have no idea what that's about. The phone was halfway across the room. So the second approach is to read it in mythic terms. And then the third approach, which has been until recently the dominant scholarly approach, is to read it as a historical window into a particular time and place. So what I want to do is discuss each of those three approaches, tell you a bit more about how people take those approaches, and then describe some of the strengths and weaknesses of each of them. And that will probably take most of our time together this evening. Let's think first of all together a little bit about what I'm calling the roadmap approach to apocalyptic literature. The roadmap, I'm going to do it at the end.
Okay.
The roadmap approach to apocalyptic literature assumes that what we find there is a roadmap to the future. In other words, the images, the stories that are told in the second half of Daniel and the book of Revelation somehow reveal to us something about how things are going to unfold, what they're going to look like, what's going to happen, who the major players are, how God is going to bring things about. And the roadmap approach has been used again and again to do that, very often drawing on the specific circumstances of the day and time. There were roadmap approaches near the end of the first century that looked at the unfolding kind of historical events at the end of the first century. There were roadmap approaches taken to reading biblical literature at the end of the first millennium. And there have been more recent approaches that take a kind of roadmap approach to apocalyptic literature that occurred during the world wars, during the Cold War, and in the shadow of the possibility of nuclear war. And those approaches have been used again and again in the course of the wars in the Middle East. It's been kind of an enduring approach to apocalyptic literature, and it's also been a fairly controversial approach to reading apocalyptic literature. There were those who opposed putting the book of Revelation, for example, in the New Testament canon for fear that it would be read as a kind of roadmap or window into events of the future. And Martin Luther, the great Protestant reformer, was pretty critical of the book of Revelation for that very same reason. On the other hand, people like Augustine, whom we'll talk about later and took a different approach, actually defended the place of Revelation in the New Testament canon. What it is a roadmap to regularly in this kind of approach involves questions about the end of all things, or what's called in theological circles eschatology. And what roadmap readings of the book of Revelation have focused on has been what is kind of understood as the end of days. And the questions that have revolved around Daniel, Revelation, have often revolved around the connection between the images and events in apocalyptic literature and essentially what you see transpiring in your newspaper or online. And the effort's been to match those things up and to ask questions about it. So, for example, during the 1960s, one of the theories that some interpreters explored was the question as to whether or not the beast wounded in the head in Revelation was a reference to John Kennedy after his assassination. And there were people who theorized that Kennedy was going to be was not in fact dead, but had been whisked off to Scorpio Island uh, when Jacqueline Kennedy remarried, and that the president had been so gravely wounded that people in the inner circle had attempted to avoid a crisis in presidential sequencing, and that he had not in fact perished as a result of the assassination, and would return as a charismatic leader, miraculously recovered, and leading the world into a one world government. There have been a lot of efforts like that. There have been various popes who have been identified as the Antichrist, and so on. A third thing that the roadmap approach assumes is therefore that the image can be unpacked literally, that it has some sort of historical counterpart. So the roadmap approach doesn't focus very much on asking what the poetic power of those images might be. Instead, fourth point here, it focuses instead on seeing a correspondence between the images and events that are transpiring or that might transpire. And for that reason, finally, the roadmap approach really focuses on decoding the images in Revelation and in the book of Daniel. When we read poetic literature, sometimes we let the images and that kind of thing carry us along, and we imagine multiple possibilities for the images. That's not so typical in a roadmap approach. In a roadmap approach, you're looking for a historical figure who can be 666, and you're looking for specific events that can be kind of guideposts to what's about to happen. And so it has a much more kind of one image, one implication kind of approach to reading the literature. Now, where did all of this come from? Well, the best known representative of this approach is a school of thought called dispensationalism. It was founded, invented, developed at first by a man by the name of John Nelson Darby. Darby belonged to the Plymouth Brethren. He was born in London in 1800 and died in 1882. And he developed an approach to biblical and human history that divided time into what he called dispensations or eras, each of which was marked by certain characteristic ways of God working in the world. So Darby was trying to kind of come up with a template for understanding the whole of biblical and human history. Broadly speaking, he argued that there were two larger dispensations that could be broken down into smaller dispensations. And the big dispensations were the dispensation of law and the dispensation of grace. And Darby argued that you could divide the whole of the Bible and the whole of the human experience into those two eras. The dividing line for Darby was the cross and the death of Jesus. So that everything before the cross, which would be the Old Testament and the ministry of Jesus, belonged to an old dispensation, Darby argued, in which God tried to use the law to save humankind. And on the other side of the cross was the dispensation of grace. And in that dispensation, Darby argued that what God was trying to do was trying to save humankind by grace through faith in Jesus Christ. And that kind of broader theological approach led him to then think about the whole of Scripture as belonging to two dispensations, and then he broke it down into smaller dispensations, and his followers developed charts like this.
You don't need to explain.
And I'm not going to try to explain the whole thing here. I just want you to see how it kind of works. You see the dispensation of law here, the dispensation of grace here, the cross as the dividing line, and then he breaks it out into greater detail. And at the end of the chart, way over here on the right, and up above here in the right-hand corner, he breaks it down even to smaller events where he draws very specifically on books like the book of Revelation to work out the details of how the end is going to take place. This actually comes from a book by a man by the name of Clarence Larkin, who was a dispensationalist.
This is also, these kinds of charts are the places where the notion that there's going to be this rapture and then there's going to be a terrible time of tribulation for people, which we don't know how long that it's going to last until the new world or new creation comes. All of that comes from this kind of dispensationalism and dividing up of history into a certain way. But if you read the Left Behind series or tried to read it, if you've seen any of the really terrible movies they've made out of it, all of that comes from this particular kind of thinking about apocalyptic literature and Revelation.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I just got to jump in here for a
Sure.
second because
Sure.
this always makes me laugh. So I grew up very, very Pentecostal. The first time I saw this, I was 13 years old. And it just was, looking at it now and being more theologically trained now, it's just, I laugh every time I see it because it's just amusing to me. And having read the Left Behind series, I was handed the Left Behind series instead of reading, like terrible books like Harry Potter and things like that, which are so much better than magic.
I remember getting the kids Left Behind.
Oh gosh, it's even worse. It's
the
so
kid
bad.
left behind. Oh my! I didn't know there
It's
was one.
so
I
bad.
got 3 of them in my Easter basket one year, and I was like, Mom, I'm sorry, I find these so boring, and I never read them.
I swear, the Berenstain Bears wrote better books.
So, well, the other thing about dispensationalism is depending on who's doing the writing and when they live, they are always living in the days just before the rapture. So, we're always in the last age. We're never somewhere else. It's always very much at the end. And so they interpret whatever current events are to be the very last days before the rapture and before the tribulation starts, and then Christ will come again. So anyway.
Yeah. This view, I'm not going to get into a lot of the details about it, about the history of it, because it has a long, detailed history of it. But it came to the United States through a man by the name of C.I. Scofield, born in 1843, lived to 1921, fought in the Civil War, was part of a Tennessee regiment.
Deserted to the Union.
Deserted to the Union Army, lived in Missouri, eventually advertised himself as the Reverend C.I. Scofield, D.D., Doctor of Divinity, though there is no record of him ever being given a Doctor of Divinity by any institution. But what he did do, and this gave dispensationalism powerful traction in the United States was he developed the Scofield Study Bible, which was one of the first and most popular study Bibles in the United States. It was actually published for some years by Oxford University Press, of all things. And basically what it had was notes to guide your reading of Scripture. And the notes were all very much out of a dispensationalist point of view. So Scofield was a huge force in advancing roadmap readings of Scripture, because basically for a lot of people, they read the biblical text and read Scofield's notes, and the one interpreted the other, and the close proximity of the interpretation and the biblical text gave a lot of people the sense that what they were getting was the meaning of apocalyptic literature and other parts of the Bible.
They're one of the largest seminaries in the country now is, you're going to talk, and Fred will talk about that. Back in the day when Sam's Club used to sell Bibles on their book table all the time, I don't think they do that so much anymore. This was the single most popular study Bible bought at Sam's, and it outweighed any other study Bible that they offered by multiples. So if you could look around your house and look around parents' houses, there's probably a Scofield Study Bible there somewhere. And they started doing the red letter Bibles, with all the words of Jesus outlined in red, and things like are done in red. And so the Scofield Study Bible became everybody's Bible. It just was, it didn't matter. Perhaps Catholics didn't have it in their home, but almost every Protestant had one in their home.
Yeah, that's true. The thing that gave dispensationalism traction in modern America comes from three forces in particular. One is Dallas Theological Seminary in Dallas, Texas. It was founded in 1924 by a man by the name of Louis Sperry Chafer. And Dallas Seminary actually trained dispensationalist preachers.
It still does,
and still does. Dallas, I don't know whether they still claim this now, but there was a time when Dallas Seminary claimed that if you got a Dallas man, and they were all men,
still are,
and I think they still are, you got a Dallas man. You would get a predictable dispensationalist line of thinking. Just a little sort of diversion. I had a friend who lived in Dallas long before I ever lived there, and long before I knew enough theologically to know what Dallas Seminary was all about. And I visited that friend and stayed with him and his family for a week, and visited Dallas Seminary, found out that they had a 4-year-long Master of Divinity program instead of 3, that they emphasized biblical interpretation, and they required students to know both Hebrew and Greek. And this all sounded very good and very rigorous to me. And not knowing anything about where they were theologically, I applied, and I was accepted. But after being accepted, I discovered that they required you at the end of your third of 4 years to sign a statement saying, basically, I'm a dispensationalist. And if you didn't sign that statement, you were asked at the end of your third year to go finish your degree somewhere else. So I wrote to the admissions department and said, I've applied, I've been accepted. I'm really looking forward to coming. but I've been deeply shaped by Methodist theology, Wesleyan theology, and the theology of John Wesley. And what I'm asking is, granted, I would respect the commitments of the seminary. Would I be allowed to graduate without being a dispensationalist? And I waited and waited and waited for a letter and a response. And finally, the director of admissions wrote back and said, I apologize for taking so much time to respond, but I find it very easy to put difficult letters at the bottom of my correspondence. But I've now talked to the admissions committee, and I think that you would be much happier if you did your degree at another seminary, at a Methodist seminary, or a seminary with, quote, a less concisely defined theological position than that of Dallas Theological Seminary. And the letter said, accordingly, your admission has been withdrawn. So Dallas Seminary, which is a pretty large seminary actually, enrollment-wise, has been a real force in advancing dispensationalism. The second force was Hal Lindsey, who was a Dallas graduate and who took his notes from Dallas Seminary, put them together with his analysis of events, political and social, in the late 60s, early 70s, and wrote Late Great Planet Earth, which ended up in grocery store checkout lines in paperback form, has gone through, I think, over 13 editions, and has sold 15 million copies since it first appeared in 1971.
Was wildly popular in my high school in 1972 or so, especially among students who were not church affiliate. They loved the Late Great Planet Earth, and it fit with all of the end of the world, nuclear holocaust is coming sorts of things that we were all brought up on. And so they liked it because it told them how the world was going to end, and it was going to happen soon.
Right. Yep. And then to top it all off, in the 90s, over the space of 13 novels written by Tim LaHaye, what Tim LaHaye did was Tim LaHaye, who also pastored congregations, and he and his wife did marriage counseling
in Dallas.
For men and women in evangelical churches, wrote a series of 13 novels called the Left Behind novels. And basically what he did was he popularized dispensationalist readings of Daniel and Revelation and apocalyptic literature by not writing a theological work, but by applying his theological understandings to a fictional account of what would happen at the end of days. And LaHaye, in interviews, when he was asked about whether or not he really believed all of this would happen the way he described it in the novels, very cleverly responded, I can't promise that it will, but it's certainly possible that this is the way God's will for the world will unfold. So he took a powerful fictional account, hinted that it could be just in fact a factual account of the way all things would end, and had it both ways. And of course it ended up being a series of movies as well, with Nicolas Cage and others appearing in them. And so they got the backing of Hollywood, which was looking for a more evangelical movie-going audience. Now, before I'm going to pause here in a moment and take this down so we can talk a bit before we talk about approach number 2. But let me talk about the strengths and let me talk about the weaknesses. one of the strengths, or one could say one of the appeals to the roadmap approach to reading apocalyptic literature in the Bible, is that it makes the symbolic language easy to grasp. Because it's working on decoding the language, and because what it's trying to do is say, with the Bible in one hand, okay, there's a reference to 666. There's a reference to 1,000-year reign. There's a reference to a great battle. What would that great battle be all about? What would 666 be all about? Who's appropriate as a candidate now for 666? It makes it very easy to think about the symbolic language. You don't, in a way, you don't really need to probe the history of those images. You don't have to look at the complex way they were used over millennia. You don't have to ask yourself what the author might have had in mind, who knew nothing about the contemporary scene. You just move from the images to your newspaper. So the connections might be frightening, but they're easily identified. It also means that the appeal revolves around the fact that a book that seems very obscure and people don't easily read instead find it's immediately relevant. It's giving me clues to what's going on in my world. So it has the kind of appeal that predictions about the future have always had. And it feeds off of the slipstream of guesswork about what's going to happen next. And for that reason, it's also very strongly appealing in an emotional fashion. I mean, one of the real appeals to Late Great Planet Earth and the sequel that Lindsay wrote, which was called Terminal Generation, is the notion that we could well be the terminal generation, the last group of people to ever live. And so in reading apocalyptic literature that way, you don't have to think about the possibility that you will die and that the world will go on without you. You are sort of instead standing at the linchpin of history, and the choices you make determine whether or not you're raptured out of this misery or you're punished. And it has that kind of emotional appeal that comes with thinking, we're not a part of the long cavalcade of human beings who have come and gone trying to figure out what it means to live faithfully as Christians. The downside to it are these, though. For one thing, it takes a very singular or eccentric approach to apocalyptic literature. What I mean by that is this. When we read the Bible, we usually ask, who wrote this? What did they have in mind? Who were the people they were writing to? What were the circumstances they were facing? And why would the writer have said what the writer said to his or her contemporaries? So, we try to locate Corinth. We try to figure out what was going on in Corinth and in the Corinthian church. We try to figure out what Paul hoped to say to them. And we try to figure out why Paul would have said certain things to them based upon our understanding of the events of the day. A dispensationalist approach to apocalyptic literature suddenly puts a hard stop on that effort and says, this time, never mind the history, never mind what the original writer and readers might have thought about all of this. let's think about what it means for us as 21st century readers. So it's a break with the way that we read all the rest of Scripture. The second thing is that it makes assumptions about Scripture in general that misrepresent the message of Scripture. To divide the message of Scripture into a dispensation of law and a dispensation of grace is to fundamentally misrepresent what the Old Testament is about. The Old Testament does not teach that people are saved by the law. It teaches that people were saved by the grace of God in forging a covenant with Israel. And the law was given Israel to tell Israel, to help Israel understand what that covenantal life would look like. Nowhere in the Old Testament is the law represented as the engine of salvation. To be sure, in the New Testament, Jesus and Paul sometimes talk about the possibility that the law might be misused and used as a means of salvation. But that's not what the message of the Old Testament is all about. And then the other problem with it, and I could have broken this out in other ways, but this seemed to be the simplest approach. It requires the reader to believe that the original writings had little meaning or purpose for their first readers. In other words, I'll put it this way. If you read the book of Daniel or the book of Revelation as a window into what's happening to our day and time, then what you're really proposing is that the original readers of Daniel in 167 BC and the original readers of the book of Revelation in the last decade of the first century got those two books and read them and said, search me what they mean. But you know who will know what it means? People living on a continent that no one knows exists, in a country that doesn't exist, speaking a language that doesn't exist, facing circumstances that no one can imagine. And when you begin to think about the dispensationalist or roadmap approach to Scripture in that way, you really begin to understand the problem with it. Because it really does, in a sense, treat that part of the Bible in a way that requires you to believe that suddenly we're looking at something that's rather more like a crystal ball than a book of the Bible. Now, let me stop there before we talk about the second approach, and let's just have some conversation. Comments, questions, observations.
I'm sitting here saying, does that mean that apocalyptic is some sort of a branch from prophetic?
No, prophetic literature, Howard, first of all, I would say that apart from saying that in the end, God will triumph and God will have God's way, that there, apart from that promise, okay, that God will triumph and that a new heaven and a new earth will come, there isn't actually predictive literature in the Old Testament or the New. Not in the Edgar Casey, if you know who Edgar Casey was, kind of sense of the word, as someone who makes predictions about the future. Prophetic literature does talk about the future, but it talks about the future in terms of the moral consequences of the choices that people make. It says, you keep going this way. You trust the chariots of Egypt rather than the God of Israel. It's not going to work out well for you. You keep throttling the poor, and it's not going to work out well for you. You keep living in disobedience, or you keep ignoring God's law.
Or worshiping other
gods. Bad things are going to happen. That's not really predictive history, or predictive literature, it's cautionary literature. It's the way my teachers put it years ago, the prophets don't foretell things, they foretell things. In other words, they don't make predictions about the future, they tell the truth, the God's truth about what's going to happen if we don't live in a responsible, faithful way. So I would say that the writers of apocalyptic literature and prophetic literature share some of the same concerns. I would also say that they share some of the same experiences. The writers of apocalyptic literature are people, and we'll come back to this point later on, they are people who experience an epiphany. They suddenly see the world for what it is. And they believe that God, if we're prepared to listen, will tell us the truth about our world. And the prophets typically use those experiences differently than the writers of apocalyptic literature. As it were, the prophets sort of start there and then they say, okay, then this is how you need to think about your lives together. The writers of apocalyptic literature sort of stick with the experience and tell the story of what they see. Does that help?
Yeah, I was just thinking that I served a Missouri Synod church down in the Lakewood area for about 17 years, although I was still ELCA Lutheran. Mm-hmm. They overlooked that politely. But I also saw a lot of the literature that came out of a guy named Herman Otten, who was the guy who was trying to sink the Missouri Synod, I swear.
Yeah.
And he put great stress by the fact that all the prophecies of Isaiah that he felt came true and prophesied what happened in the time of Christ, a lot of what's reflected in the Messiah, also were very predictive.
Yeah.
That you therefore could trust everything that he was saying because it was all laid out and these bad things were going to happen.
Yeah. Well, and part of the reason we're talking about it is that I think you're right. A lot of mainline Protestants skirt these issues and they don't talk about it. But when you begin to look at the millions of people who read people like LaHaye, as a priest, the thing that's become really clear to me is, this was clear to me too, teaching biblical studies in a seminary, is that I may not want to think about the influence that dispensationalists have, but they have actually convinced millions of people that the only way to read that literature is to read it the way that they do.
And Howard, to your point about the use of Isaiah, this is something we'll come back to, and the use of Isaiah in the New Testament, for example, in Matthew. We can't get into it in a deep way, but it is something we'll touch on repeatedly as we go through here, because there is a way that the New Testament, and we'll see it in Revelation, that the New Testament relies upon the Old for both images and ways of thinking about something. the issue with Isaiah and the prophecies of Isaiah about a young woman conceiving or the suffering servant isn't that those were predictive necessarily, as that they were the images with which Israel had learned to think about what the Messiah would be like.
Right.
And that's a different, it wasn't saying that in the year 4 BC or 4 AD, this baby will be born in Bethlehem and we will know that that baby is the Messiah, because it was the set of images with which Israel thought when it thought about a Messiah. And so after Jesus died, then it was clear to Paul, we've talked about that in the Paul class, it was clear to Matthew, it was clear to the other writers of the Gospels, this was what we've been thinking about and what we long for.
Yeah.
So anyway.
Yeah. Let me push ahead and describe the second approach. The second approach, I said, was the mythic approach. The mythic approach assumes that apocalyptic literature contains timeless truths. Oops, now it didn't. I changed it to slideshow and it took me away from my slide. There we go. So unlike the dispensationalist approach, which says here's an image and there's some one thing out there in the near future that will correspond to it. What the mythic approach does is it reads Daniel and it reads Revelation, and it says there's always someone like 666. There's in every day and generation, there's always an antichrist. In every day and generation, you always have to choose whether or not you're going to live in the city of God. So the imagery is treated as timeless and recurring. And the images and the stories and the narrative also have to do with the real or deeper nature of an experience, an event, or a person. So the images are meant to be explored to give you an idea of what it means to be taken captive by forces that are not of God, and what it means to be faithful and to live for God. And as a result, the people who take mythic approaches usually do not decode the images. They instead, what they do is they kind of think about the images as a series of paintings on the wall. And they say, well, it's kind of like this, or you might think about it this way in the next painting, or you might think about it this way in the next painting. And so they sort of emphasize the evocative rather than emphasizing decoding the images. And so if that's the case, then interpretation can't be about the decoding that people do. This approach, like the others, is lodged in some earliest of the readers of Scripture. Origen, who lived from 185 to 254, is an example of this. Origen believed that Scripture might have a surface meaning or a literal meaning that belonged to a particular time and place. But he believed that you might not get the full meaning of a scriptural text by looking at the meaning, the surface meaning. So you might look there for the moral significance of what was being said in Scripture. And he took the approach that said, you know, if you didn't find either one of those, then the meaning of a particular text might be spiritual or allegorical. And so he was inclined to read apocalyptic literature in that fashion. But so was St. Augustine. Augustine, who lived from 354 to 430 and was Bishop of Hippo in northern Africa, believed that if you read the book of Revelation, you were always getting an insight into the nature of the world around you. So, for example, he argued that the beast of Revelation 13:1 has multiple counterparts in human history. There's not just one beast, but in any day and time, past, present, and yet to come, there are other kinds of beasts that people should resist. And so Augustine, he did believe that there was a real sort of future point, and that would be the point at which God brought history to a conclusion and reigned over it all. But in describing that drama, what Augustine believed was that there were elements in that drama that you see and experience in any day and age. The strength of the mythic approach is that it takes revelation seriously. It believes that Scripture can really reveal things to us if we're attentive to it. You might not argue that you've had an epiphany. It might make you uncomfortable to say, I've had a manifestation of God. But the mythic approach encourages people to remember that Scripture is meant to tell us something about the will of God, and it might tell us something about the reality of the challenges that we face. It also takes the symbolic character of apocalyptic literature seriously. It realizes that the power of this literature is evocative, that it uses images and narrative and symbols to try to get at something deeper. It's power that's analogous to the power of poetry. You can describe your love in terms of her, height and the appearance of her face and the color of her hair, or you can say she's like a red, red rose. And it also offers the reader a window into the literature that's morally challenging. Augustine and others who read Daniel and the book of Revelation mythically said, if you think about these images, it will tell you something about how to live in the world now. So it's less preoccupied just with the end of things. Its weaknesses, and Jacques Ellul, who's been dead now for decades, but was a French French philosopher who wrote commentaries on biblical books, including the book of Revelation. The weakness is that it might ignore what can be learned from the original historical setting. If you set aside what it meant in the past entirely, you might not understand some of what the original writer intended. And you might then miss the possible guidance that the original historical setting offers. So we've got one more to look at, but let me pause and ask you if you've got any questions about the mythic approach. Okay.
I'm over it.
You're over it? Okay. Okay. All right. Then let's take a look at a third approach. The third approach could be called the historical approach. And it treats apocalyptic literature as a window into a particular time and place. Daniel was written in 167 BC. The book of Revelation was written probably in the last decade of the first century. They had specific writers. Daniel was writing to Jews. John was writing to Christians in Asia Minor. And that means that the original apocalypse made sense to them. When they read about it, they were reading about challenges that they faced. They were reading about kingdoms they knew about. It spoke to their circumstances. And the original setting provides clues to the writer's intended meaning. A good example of this is the letter to the people of Laodicea in the book of Revelation. The resurrected and glorified Christ says, I know your works, people in Laodicea, but you're not hot and you're not cold. So I'm going to spew you out of my mouth. If you read that without reference to the history and the setting, what a lot of people think that means is that Jesus in John's vision is saying to the church, you could be hot, meaning you could be really sold out to the gospel, or you could be honest sinners and pagans and be cold. And I could put up with either great faithfulness or blatant refusal to be faithful and judge accordingly. But you're just kind of non-committal and you're just lukewarm water, so I'm going to spew you out of my mouth. When you begin reading about the history of Laodicea, though, you discover that in Laodicea there were healing waters, and some of them were hot, and some of them were cold. So what John's vision really says to Laodicea is, you could be redemptive, healing waters blessed by God. And you could be hot redemptive waters, and you could be cold redemptive waters. But you're not redemptive at all. So I'm going to spew you out of my mouth. So the image of cold water is not negative. It's two different kinds of faithful practice and people. And so what the writer is saying is not, I could roll with really faithful people and I could roll with sinners, but you're neither one, so I'm done with you. What he's saying is that you're no kind of faithful. So the history and the culture of the time helps you to understand what the book is really saying. The strengths of that approach are that it takes the book's original setting seriously. And it treats apocalyptic literature in some ways in the same fashion that we treat all of the rest of Scripture. It takes the original setting and the writer's intention as a guide to what's meant. It also takes advantage of the clues that information offers and effectively says, we can figure out how to read Scripture and what might be legitimate readings and what might be illegitimate readings to the extent that it corresponds with what's likely historically. So you can't just read anything into the Bible. You have to know something about what the writers and readers are likely to have meant and thought. The downside to it is that it runs the risk of historicism. In other words, you might say, well, it's just a book locked up in the past. It doesn't really have anything to say to us. And that can minimize the revelatory nature of Scripture. It can mean that we don't look to it for a window into our own lives, and therefore it can really diminish the power that it has to change us. The person who gets the most benefit out of Scripture not only reads Scripture, but allows Scripture to read the person themselves. Okay, let me stop there then and see what we have by way of questions or observations in the time that we have left.
Do you want me to set up that video?
I can do that
Okay.
more easily. Thoughts? Question?
I'm curious, you talked about the Dallas Theological Seminary and dispensationalism. Are any of these other approaches kind of aligned with certain varieties of mainstream?
No, not particularly, Paul. I mean, outside of Dallas, I would say that most seminaries in the United States probably borrow on a combination of the mythic approach and the historical approach. Some of them may lapse a little bit more heavily toward the historical approach. Some may lapse a little bit more heavily toward the mythic approach. And it actually depends not so much on the seminaries as it does on the professors.
Yeah, those two in some combination are pretty much standard Catholic and Protestant readings of the book of Revelation outside of dispensationalist circles.
Yeah.
So that was certainly the combination. The first book that I ever studied in depth in seminary, and it happened to be because that's what came up that year and translated from the Greek, was the book of Revelation. And that was the combination was the approach that we were given to interpret the text.
Right.
So,
yeah. Does that help, Paul?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Other questions or observations?
Most excellent, revealing presentation. Thank you.
thanks, Jack.
I look forward to being here at every session that I can.
Well,
Thanks.
thanks.
So could a person be a little bit of all three?
I think it would be really hard to make the dispensationalist part of it work. The one thing you might carry out of a dispensationalist approach is to say, well, there is something future here, that's for sure. And the element that's future is the conviction that arises throughout the New Testament, which is that God is in charge of history and that God will bring all things to a close in the way that God sees fit. But it would be, I think, really hard to get beyond that point. So
I have to admit that the late Great Earth was in my home when I was growing up. I attempted to read it, but it just didn't seem right to me. And I knew nothing, literally nothing about, at that point in my life, about Christianity. But it just didn't, it smelled wrong. Or I'm sorry, read wrong.
yeah, well,
Yeah.
and I think that's a natural reaction, Jack. A lot of people, and then on the other hand, a lot of people end up being deeply influenced by the dispensationalist view, and are afraid that if they read it any other way, that they're reading it unfaithfully. And I think one of the biggest challenges I had teaching, well, not just college students, but seminarians, was convincing them that there were great truths to be had in apocalyptic literature, but they didn't lie in decoding the future using it. And to give them their due, I mean, dispensationalists have been really effective that way. They've been really wildly influential, even as problematic as the approach really is.
Yeah, I think probably without even realizing that was sort of my understanding, the decoding thing. And from my perspective, I always thought, whether the end is tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock or a couple of millennials away, does that really change what I need to be doing right now, right?
Yeah.
So what is the value of studying this? And I think it helped me tonight, kind of helped me see the value of it.
Well, I think you're right, Kathleen. And then there's that little bit of wisdom from Jesus that says, no one knows the day or the time.
Yes.
So there's that as well. Let me close.
Okay, wait, because Mike Fraley's going to put in a plug.
I'm sorry,
Tell us
go ahead,
about
Mike.
a thief in the night, Mike, because...
Oh, sorry, I just dropped that into the chat because it kept mentioning problematic narratives, and I'm like, okay, no one has mentioned A Thief in the Night yet, and that was like classic doomsday 1970s film about the end times, to make sure that the Antichrist scared the hell out of us so we would all get into heaven.
Yeah.
Indeed.
You're right, Mike, and thank you for reminding me of that. I actually knew the son of one of the producers of Thief in the Night, and evidently in his later life he lived a life of alcoholism, and that whole movie experience was the one linchpin in his experiences. But you're right. I mean, if you get people young enough and you tell them the story of apocalyptic literature that way, it's really hard to shake it. And the logic actually of that reading, that approach to scripture is that if you're faithful, you'll read it that way. And if you question reading it that way, you've proven you're unfaithful. And so it's this, I love the fact that you mentioned this because in terms of spiritual development, you're trapped. The whole thing is a circular firing squad.
I wanted to say, you said nobody actually knows, when it's going to come. But there was a girl in my elementary school when I was in about 4th or 5th grade. Her name was Megan, and she was very, very sure that we were not coming back from Christmas break because the end was coming. And we were standing in the library, having library class or whatever, and she just casually let me know that we were not coming back.
Yeah.
And that was going to be the end.
Did she happen to read the book 1988 and then the subsequent sequel 1989, which both forecasted the end of the world? And when one was published and it didn't happen, the sequel sure promised it was still going to happen.
Yeah. Well, Hal Lindsey very subtly moved from, writing about nuclear holocaust and the USSR. And years later wrote about the war in Iraq and ancient Babylon and all the rest of it. One of the amazing things about dispensationalism is no matter how many times the explanation falls apart, people seem to find a way to reinvent it,
So Liz, I'm interested, did that frighten you when she said that? Or did you just go, she's silly, she's crazy?
I don't think I even knew what to make of it. I remember just being really like, what is she talking about? Like, I mean, I grew up Episcopalian. We did not talk about the end of days.
Exactly.
It was like, what are you talking about? But it definitely left an impression. I mean, this was like a 20-second conversation, and it's like seared into my brain that she was thoroughly convinced that we were coming back from Christmas break because the end of the world was coming.
Yeah.
So, Perry, were you gonna? Yeah.
I'm just gonna say, I remember in the 80s taunting some of my friends who were rock-ribbed Republicans with the fact that Ronald Wilson Reagan had 666, and I didn't believe that, but it was a lot of fun to play with.
So, well, I can remember the first time I tried to teach. This was right around Y2K. You guys remember Y2K? The world was going to end at the turn of the millennium, right?
Yeah.
And I was teaching Revelation, and I started in this class, and I had just become an Episcopalian. Okay, so I became an Episcopalian right after New Year's that year, and I had these folks raise their hand, and they go, "Why are you talking about this? We're Episcopalians. We don't even know what that means, and we don't read that kind of stuff," meaning the book of Revelation. And it was just like, but we were in Dallas, by the way, and everybody was reading Left Behind, including all those Episcopalians who had no idea what I was talking about and who would never think of reading the book of Revelation. So it was just really, it was just funny because the whole, I resonate with Liz's. I was Episcopalian. We never talked about
It really is throughout the culture, even people who aren't Christians. I used to have a credit card, and the security code in the back was 666. When you give it, whoa, hey, oh, you sure? Oh, come on, people.
Well, was not uncommon in Dallas to see a bumper sticker on cars that said, "In case of rapture, this car will be without a driver." But back when I was writing my book on Revelation, though, I got into this long conversation with my editor because it was the first in the series, and it had to be named after books of the Bible, so it was pretty boring. But what I had wanted to do was I wanted to entitle it "Leaving Behind, Left Behind." And I had told my editor at the time I wanted a bumper sticker that said, "Hey Tim, if you're raptured, can I have your bank account?"
So how many of you tried to read or did read the Left Behind series?
I read about 25, 30 pages of the first book and could not. Well, it was just so bad, right?
Every single novel, every single book, every single letter. I loved the radio drama. I was hooked as a child.
Wow.
God bless you, Alan.
Yeah.
Then we have to
I'm all sorts of confused as a mutt of a theological experiment.
We actually know.
Still here.
Alan, I mean, you should have told me that story a long time ago. That would have generated such sympathy.
I read the book for the same reason why I read I don't even remember the name of it, that sparkly vampire novel, whatever that was.
Oh,
it was
Twilight.
That's the one. And it's because I knew that it was circulating in my congregation enough that I at least needed to speak intelligently about the contents, because if it's resonating with the people, I should know what's resonating with the people and try to figure out why, and then have the conversation from there. Right. And I hope the rest of you enjoyed Left Behind very much.
He didn't miss much.
I read the first book and Woo! Yeah, I read it, and I'm proud that I made it through.
You got further than a lot of us.
You're a better man than me, Mike. I got through about 25 pages on the same theory, and I began to worry about what would happen to my own writing if I read the entire thing. So I had to quit.
We grew up with them in the house because when they came out, my mom would buy them as they were published. So we had a whole bookshelf dedicated just to those.
Oh,
and
wow.
They looked so intimidating as a kid. And they had like a book study or something at the church. And we were part of an ELCA church as well.
Oh, yeah.
When we were kids. And that's why I got the kid ones in my Easter basket, but only 3 because I refused to read them. But I remember them like coming back with discussion questions about like, should we trust the euro? Is that a sign of the end times?
Right, right.
Oh, there was all sorts of stuff like that. That was
the United Nations.
Yeah.
But yeah, that there was all sorts of stuff like that, and it was so prevalent in churches. I was a Methodist preacher at the time. That it was extraordinary because it was like this is another one of my pet hates, Dan Brown, and pretty much anything that Dan Brown writes, because people will people have accepted Dan Brown's story as though it's all true and really history. You know, I'm the one with the degree in Christian history and doctrine, and my father will tell me stuff from Dan Brown and tell me that this is the way it really happened. And you have to honor your father and mother, but I have to tell you, there are times. And so it's the novel as a form, the novel is so incredibly powerful. But we don't often appreciate how much that gets lodged into people's heads, so that, you know, there are people that will herever after believe that the rapture means that they go to bed and their night dress is left lying in the sheets and there's no person there anymore. You know, or at one place they were draped over the plane seats, but fortunately the pilots weren't raptured, so the plane did not crash. It's just terrible.
It's really funny because several months ago, we actually got an email to our podcast account. Someone wanted us to review their phone app game that was based off of dispensational theology. You got that email too, Mike?
Yes, I did. And I got maybe 3 turns into it and said,
Crazy town.
Yeah, you're wiser. You're wiser. I played the whole game because I just needed to know how it was going to end.
Does it have a high replayability factor? That's what I want to know.
No. I mean, you knew that wasn't going to happen.
What's interesting too is like we talk about this like it's an older thing, but we ran into some of this like distrust of larger conglomerations of nations in Scotland as a means for why you supported Brexit. Like this is not an uncommon thing. It's just expressed in very interesting ways.
Yeah.
I mean, the thing is, this sort of interpretation of apocalyptic literature offers the same tantalizing tidbits that conspiracy theory does and did mystery religions.
Yeah.
Because it offers, you're confronted with an existential horror of reality, and then you are presented with a secret wisdom of which you are the select who are able to decode what's really going on.
Right.
So this isn't just apocalyptic literature craziness. I mean, it is a manifestation of something that is a theme in our culture.
Yes.
Which is one thing that we can really look at when we address this, is why is this so tantalizing?
Right.
Well, and
that's a really important point, Mike, and it's part of the reason it's as wildly popular as it is.
Yeah. And it's a big subplot behind apocalyptic movies. You know, we can explain to you why the world is going to end.
Yeah.
the sort of conviction that a lot of us have that it can't possibly go on like this because it's just that bad.
Yeah. So there are these secular apocalyptic movies. If you don't think God's going to get the world or the Antichrist is going to get the world, you talk about global flooding or world-ending
invasions by aliens.
Invasions by aliens.
Something like that.
Yeah.
So anyway, we'll start next week with a little video that we've got on apocalyptic literature, just because that's a helpful refresher. And then we might actually get into Daniel 1 and 2.
There you go.
Which should, I would encourage you in your study Bible, if you haven't, to read at least some of the study guide notes about the book of Daniel before you, as we start class. It'll be really helpful because the dreams and everything do have a pattern. And if you haven't watched the video yet, that's available on the website page. And I sent you guys all a link to that in the email for this meeting. So that little video is real helpful in sort of making sense of the structure of Daniel.
And we will get the slide. Catherine asked about the slides. We'll figure out how to get the slides to you too.
Yeah, and Mike, you didn't miss the email. There was some miscommunication about who was going to communicate to the people who signed up through Church Suite Text and Church. So we'll get that taken care of for you, and get all of that information out
Those
there.
of you who are visiting for the first time, we're really delighted to have you with us. Thanks for coming.
And let us go in peace to love and serve the Lord.
Thanks be to
Thanks
God.
be to God. Good night.
Peace, everybody.
Good night.